Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Frederick Kempe, President and CEO, Atlantic Council.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. The Atlantic Council is honored to serve as a partner in the 2012 Concordia Summit. This powerful convening comes at a critical time in global affairs, especially as we look beyond our own electoral cycle and the uncertainty of a post-Brexit Europe. We at the Atlantic Council think that the defining moment of history that we face is as important now as the end of the World War I, the end of World War II, the end of the Cold War, and how the U.S. and Europe work together through this inflection point in history is going to be crucial to defining the future, and it is the purpose, fundamental purpose of the Atlantic Council. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation on the future of the European Union with a distinguished group of leaders who are each particularly relevant in charting Europe's course. If Europe is dysfunctional internally, dysfunctional externally, then our common interests on the global stage cannot be realized. Since the Atlantic Council's founding in 1961, Europe has been the United States' political, economic, and security partner of first resort. North America and Europe were, and I would say still are, the most effective global force when acting together. Conversely, when we do not act together, or when one or the other side is weak or indecisive, there's much more danger of an unraveling where less benevolent actors or chaos fills the void. Today, the United States continues to have an enormous strategic stake in Europe's future, not totally realized or sufficiently realized in Washington, which hinges on both an effective EU and a cohesive Atlantic community. The transatlantic community is best poised to uphold the fundamental contours of a secure and prosperous world, but many of the principles that define the effort to build a more united Europe are threatened today. In Europe, they are threatened by economic stagnation, extremism, mass migration, a volatile southeastern rim, a volatile eastern front, political divisions, nationalism, just to list a few. Europe is indisputably stronger with allies and partners, but the vision and leadership that reinforce a shared future are required to reanimate, in our view, the Europe project as a force for good, not only in Europe, but for the world. And in that spirit, our panelists today will help us talk about the shape of a strategic future of the European Union, and they are uniquely qualified. And I will call them to the stage after I have introduced them all. First, I am pleased to welcome the Prime Minister of Malta, Joseph Muscat, who plays a critical role in upholding Europe's southern border as migration continues from North Africa and the Middle East. I am keen to hear the Prime Minister's plan for, quote, a new idea for Europe, unquote, as he assumes the EU Council presidency in 2017. And Mr. Prime Minister, we wish you all well in that leadership position of the EU. It is also an honor then to welcome the Vice President of the European Commission, Kristalina Georgieva. She has built vital agility into the EU budget, adapting to the unprecedented demands of migration and Eurozone crisis, a longtime friend of the Atlantic Council and our work. And I'm always happy and honored to welcome my dear friend and the chairman, former chairman of the Atlantic Council, current chairman of the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security, General Jim Jones. As the former commander of U.S. European Command, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, his knowledge of NATO and European security issues, not to mention his fluent French, is invaluable in these troubled times. General Jones is also a voice of great expertise on Europe's energy security and economic competitiveness. I hope in his comments today he will also talk about an idea that he helped spawn, about a north-south corridor, or as the Croatian and Polish president is talking about it, a 3 Cs initiative, really linking Europe not just east to west, but now also north to south. Finally, I'd like to extend a special welcome to Geoff Dyer, reporter of the Financial Times, who will moderate the conversation. Geoff has been with the FT for over a decade, reporting previously from Brazil, China, and the UK, and since 2012, Washington, D.C. on foreign policy. So without further ado, thank you again to the Concordia Summit for orchestrating this powerful consortium of partners and discussions. It's a great honor for us to participate in this. In the hope that we might, from Concordia, in the hope that we might, in the spirit of public-private and transatlantic partnership, inform an ambitious strategy for the Europe we've all worked to build and protect. I welcome you all to the, quote, uncertain future of the European Union, and I invite our panelists and moderator to the stage. Please join me in a round of applause for them.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much to the Atlantic Council and Fred for that introduction and for the invitation to take part in this event. It's a real privilege to be on such a distinguished panel here with you this afternoon. As Fred mentioned, we're going to be trying to unpack some of the issues about the future of the European Union and the overlapping crises that it faces, the refugee crisis, the economic crisis, and the underlying crisis of political legitimacy that is really affecting the EU. Fred set up the issues very effectively, but just if you allow me just to read you a couple of quotes of things that senior European officials have said recently, just to give us, to try and set up the discussion we're going to have. Earlier this year, Donald Tusk, the president of the EU Council, he said the following. He said, "The specter of breakup is haunting Europe." And his partner in the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the Commission, said earlier this year that the EU is facing an existential crisis. So I raise these issues just to give you a sense of the magnitude and the depth of the difficult issues that the EU is now facing. But we do have the perfect panel to discuss these issues, respectively from my right, Kristalina Georgieva, Vice President of the EU Commission, Joseph Muscat, the Prime Minister of Malta, and then the far right, General James Jones, former Supreme Commander of NATO in Europe and former US National Security Advisor, to give us the American perspective on all this. Now, maybe because I'm British, but I thought I'd maybe start off the discussion talking a bit about Brexit, because I think that's one way to get into some of these underlying issues about the future coherence of the EU. So if I can start with a question about Brexit, and maybe with you, Commissioner, if I can start off first. It's now been 3 months since the vote, but some time to let the dust settle and to think through what it really means. Just at the weekend, the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico, said that it was necessary that Britain's departure from the EU was painful for the UK, because otherwise it would send a message to other countries that this was not something that should be done lightly. From your view inside the Commission, is that the state of thinking at the moment? Do countries and does the Commission want this to be a painful process so that no one else within the EU would ever think about doing the same thing?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let me lighten up the spirits a little. A man in Brussels walks on the street, kicks a bottle, Ginny comes out, and Ginny says, "Thank you very much for liberating me. And I will fulfill a wish." The man says, "Great, I have to go to New York. I hate to fly. Can you build a bridge so I can drive all the way to New York?" Ginny says, "This is the most idiotic wish I have ever heard. Give me another one." The man says, "You know, these people on the other side of the channel, the Brits, can you make them to be like us continental Europeans?" Ginny says, "So how do you want the bridge? 1 lane or 2 lanes?" My point is that we have to finally recognize that there are some differences between continental Europe and the UK, and that maybe we should have been reflecting on these differences a bit earlier, more seriously. And maybe we should have made an effort to build maybe not a bridge to New York, but a bridge to the UK in policy terms. But this is now a bit behind us. And yet, when we look forward, I think we have to be very seriously thinking whether we want to have an European Union where country stays in only because it is so painful to leave that it's like going to the dentist. Or they stay in because it is in their interest. My philosophy is that we want to have a union where countries stay in because it is in their interest, and also a union that makes the best out of a very bad situation. In other words, we negotiate with the UK calmly, something that in the end allows us to continue to be more united on the basis of our values, which are there, rather than divided because they drive on the other side of the street. Because ultimately, yes, the UK is an island. Yes, we have really mental, legal, philosophical differences, but they're an island, they're not a ship. They're not gonna move to the South China Sea. They're going to be always right next to us. And in Europe now, indeed, we have this conflicting views. One that says, let's make it so painful that maybe they never leave, or nobody else is to leave. And this of us who are saying, let's look at ourselves in the mirror. Why did that happen? And how we make it so that it doesn't happen again because we are addressing the underlying causes. And just to finish, I'm sorry I'm taking a little longer, but you mentioned existential threats. Yes, we in the EU have to admit that we are facing existential questions. Can we have a union where those who have to and want to integrate further can do it? And I'm thinking of the Eurozone primarily, but not only. And those who do not want to integrate any further, may even want to be a little looser, still can do it and stay within the union. And we have to front and center address this with or without Brexit.
Prime Minister, maybe I could ask you to take that up. I think what the Slovakian Prime Minister was getting at is that the British wanted both ways. They want to have a free trade agreement with the EU, but they want to have restrictions on the movement of people between the rest of Europe and Britain. Is such agreement possible in any way? Would the rest of the other member states, your partners in the European Council, would they ever accept something like that?
No. That's a simple question. I think it's an issue of walls. I think walls have become the most architecturally talked about subject over the past few months and years. In Europe, some are building walls not to let people in. I hope Europe doesn't build walls not to let countries out at the end of the day, because it would sound like a little bit like a prison. I would be very wary of a relationship where someone tells you, if you decide to leave me, I will make it so painful that you will never get married again, that sort of thing. So the Europe I believe in is a Europe of understanding, of democracy, and of freedom. So while I respect Robert a lot, I disagree with him that Brexit should be painful. I think Brexit should be inferior to membership. Where I disagree with my British colleagues is this idea that they can come up with some concussion or agreement where they can have access to the single market, this huge market of 500 million people, and at the same time cherry-pick rules which they don't like on freedom of movement of people. It is simply not possible to do that. If we allow that, everyone would want to pick and choose his or her bits. So I would say the exit should not be painful. The result should be extremely inferior to membership. And I think that's a point on which there is convergence. I have attended, I think, since Brexit 3, council meetings, formal and informal. I think in my almost 4 years experience at European Council level, there has never been one subject where there is complete unison, irrespective of north and south, east and west, left and right. On the other hand, if I can comment on the title of this session, I think that sometimes we Europeans, we like to talk ourselves down. And then we wonder why, when we come to the United States or go to Asia, people don't only ask the Brits what will happen to the UK. They ask other Europeans what will happen to Europe. Europe is there. Europe is a political project. Look at the euro. I always submit the concept that the euro, apart from an economic project and a financial project, is a political project. No single economic project would have withstood all the pressures of 2 or 3 or 4 bailouts, an exit of one member state from the union with little fluctuation. That's because there is, yes, a strong institution, the European Central Bank, but because there is the realization that this is a political project that won't go away. So I would say there is an uncertain future, but there is a future for the European Union.
General Jones, I'd like to pick up on that point about the political project. When the Brexit vote went through 3 months ago, the dominant fear in Washington was that this would be the first stage in a broader unraveling of the EU and maybe some of the other European institutions, even maybe leaking into NATO. But now 3 months beyond that, we've had some time to think about it. How do people in the US see it from now? They see it as a discrete event on its own, or is it the start of a broader process of disintegration?
Brexit?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, as long as the UK isn't trying to recapture its colonies, I think it's probably okay.
We've tried to cut down on that.
Well, you know, I think that this is probably something for the Europeans to resolve. I'm very honored to be here on this panel. As Fred mentioned, I grew up in post-war Europe. My family moved to France in 1946. And came home in 1973, and so I spent my formative days in Europe, and my parents lived in both Paris and Brussels. And so it was really an honor for me to finish my career at NATO in 2006. So I've been accused of, in Washington circles, of being the American with the European prejudice, and I admit to a bias. I believe that it is the most essential relationship that our country has. I think it's quite possible that its best days are ahead of all of us, but I think we're going to have to do things a little bit differently. And on Brexit, I think we'll just have to wait and see what happens. I remember when I went to NATO, I met with Secretary Colin Powell at the time, and I went over to his office and I said, do you have any advice for me? And he said, well, NATO is kind of passé, and we deal with the European Union. And I was a little bit surprised, and so I remembered that. And we went over in 2003. We had 19 members. When I left, we had 26 members in NATO. NATO was involved in Afghanistan and doing out-of-area operations. And it struck me that one of the things that we in the transatlantic relationship that I think is so important and so vital to our common values and our goals and aspirations is to think about our security challenges in a more holistic way. We are not going to solve the problems of the world militarily alone. And as a former general, I can tell you that I'm absolutely convinced of that. It is that, to me, there are 3 pillars that need to be functioning together in order to bring about change on this planet. And one is security, the second one is economic development, and the third is governance and rule of law. And if you're not willing to apply those 3 pillars to your problems, you're probably not going to be successful. And if you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya as 3 examples where military force was not enough to bring about the desired end state, and you look at what was missing, you find the other 2 pillars were severely lacking and remain severely lacking today. So in the transatlantic relationship, there is tremendous potential for doing things as long as we understand that it has to be a more holistic approach. And And things like energy security, water security, food security, economic security, those are all integral parts of our common defense architecture. Fred mentioned a project that I think typifies what we can do together, we in the Transatlantic Partnership, and it's now called a 3Cs initiative, and it involves building a transmission corridor from the Baltics to the Adriatic, involving about 12 countries. It's been around for about 2 years. And I just came back from a conference in Dubrovnik where 12 nations met on this issue. And I'm very excited about this transmission corridor because it covers energy, it covers transportation, rails, roads, and telecommunications. And if we could get this going, this is a tremendous opportunity for job creation in Europe, participation with the United States. It involves some strategic aspects in terms of modifying behaviors of some of our neighbors to the east. And I think this is the kind of thing that keeps us going. The last point I would like to make is that the United States should, and I hope will, continue to play a very important role with Europe in the organizations that exist, in the EU and in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the future of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, I think, is still to be written in the sense that I don't believe that NATO can be justified, can justify its existence by being a defensive, reactive alliance that we had in the 20th century during the Cold War. Instead, I think it has to be more proactive in its activities to establish security and to help developing countries who have problems solve their own problems so that you can develop economically. And that is really part and parcel of the solution to the battle against radical fundamentalism and terrorism. So proactive, engaged North Atlantic Treaty Organization in partnership with the EU and its missions, I think is the way for the future. Thank you.
Commissioner, Prime Minister, you both said that in various ways that the EU can't rely on a strategy of pain to keep itself together. I have a colleague who sometimes jokes that the argument of the EU is that it's like Alcatraz. You know, you try to leave and you see what's going to happen to you, which might be effective in the short term, but it's not a very good long-term political strategy or philosophy. So tell us more about how you actually would present a more positive, forward-looking vision for the EU to try and hold it together, to take into all these different political tensions that the Brexit has brought to the fore. Commissioner, start with you. I mean, you hinted at the possibility that a kind of two-track EU is maybe the way forward. Maybe you could talk a little bit more how you see that would evolve.
Well, I mean, I very much agree with the Prime Minister that in Europe we have a tendency to talk ourselves down. You go to the United States, people talk themselves up. That is, in a sense, giving some ground to amnesia in Europe, because we have all these shocks. And by the way, when we talk about uncertain future, it is uncertain future for the world, not just for the European Union. We do live in a more shock-prone environment everywhere. We forget how good the EU actually is. We are still the largest economy in the world. We are the most equitable region in the world. The World Bank calls us lifestyle superpower. It is great to live in Europe, and I speak as somebody who has lived in the United States for 17 years. But we forget about that. So my first point would be, of departure would be, remember the fundamentals of the European Union, and they are still strong. They haven't gone away. We still have rule of law. We still have excellent infrastructure, very highly educated population. But that is not enough. And therefore, we have to say, OK, how can we give a more positive agenda for the EU? And there I would make 2 points. One, be less complacent about real problems that our people worry about. Top of mind concern for Europeans, by the way, not just for Europeans, is security. Terrorism is a real threat. Physical security, economic security, security of jobs, it is a major worry Well, when we look at the common themes, where in a union that is right now quite polarized, where we all come together, it is protect the external borders, make sure that we actually are no more complacent about our defense, build it forward as a way to calm down the fears of our people. And then comes the second, and even to my mind, well, I'm an economist, I'm biased, more important point. The strength of the EU is in competitiveness, and we have to continue to strive to build it. And if you boil down to what has been traditionally source of our competitive strength, it is the internal market. We can still broaden it and deepen it. Energy union, digital market, capital market, make sure that we continue to build what has been strong. Convergence, I'm in charge of the EU budget. The EU budget is like gasoline for our engine of convergence. Lift up regions and countries that are falling behind for the benefit of everybody. And I think getting us to concentrate on what actually makes us more competitive and not shy away from the really tough stuff. And the tough stuff are structural reforms. Mario Draghi, okay, the man with the bazooka. Mario Draghi time and again says, monetary policy can only take you that far. Structural reforms are what are going to make Europe strong. And we have to have the guts to go for it. At the moment, I think we have been limping from one crisis into another. We had financial crisis, economic crisis, Eurozone crisis, Greece, refugee crisis, terrorism. But what we have in Europe as most serious, the mother of all crises, is crisis of confidence. And we ought to be able to tell our people, look, we Europeans are good people, we are strong, we are resilient. We can cope with this. And I'm afraid that we are not daring to say that loudly enough. We are not also daring to say to our people, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, ours is a young union. 65 years on the scale of history. Remember the United States 65 years in your history. Where were you? Texas and California out. The dollar, not a common currency, and the Civil War was ahead. It wasn't behind. So we have to accept that the Union is going to go through changes. And also accept that we put this jacket, the Lisbon Treaty, a book that thick. Maybe we have overregulated ourselves. Maybe we have to kind of loosen up, unbutton a bit that jacket. But that we can be, as a union, we are destined to be together, and together we are stronger. This is what I think we have to be saying to our people day in, day out.
Prime Minister, give us your positive case for why Europe should be together instead of the negative case of the pains of leaving the EU.
Well, I think the starting point is that Europe doesn't mean and should not mean the same thing to everyone. So
Voila.
If you look at our points of view, say, on taxation, on migration, relations with Russia, relations with Turkey, there is no one single point of view. And I believe that is the starting point. I think it's a delusion to think that we can come to a point where 27 or 28 can agree on very tight policies, given that there are different starting points, different national interests. And to acknowledge that is not being, it's not being a bad European, but it's being a European. Our strength is in our diversity at the end of the day, and I truly believe that. It's not a cliche. I truly believe that if there is a fixation to make Europe one homogeneous group, it will, at the end of the day, just fizzle out. So that's my starting point, which leads me to where we should go. First of all, the next step should not be diminishing what we have. So it should not be rethinking the fundamental principles, the four freedoms: freedom of movement of products, of services, of capital, and of people. Those are the legacy of Europe. It's as if the United States thinks about changing fundamentally or scrapping its constitution and writing it from scratch rather than building on it. So there can be no step back. There should be some measures to make sure that those 4 freedoms are not being abused. That's okay, but not shirking from making a very solid case for the 4 freedoms. Secondly, I agree with what the Commissioner was saying. The idea of not trying to straitjacket countries, to making it not a loser union, but really and truly a union of conviction rather than of forcing countries into particular positions. And I think the euro is working quite well with all its problems or its shortcomings, but it should be a more of not only maybe 2-tier, but 3 or 4-tier if necessary. Why should I come from a country where we have neutrality enshrined in our constitution? Why should I stop other countries from making steps forward when it comes to security union and security policy? I think that's a given. Europe shouldn't be held hostage to minority views, even if it goes against maybe my national interest to say so. But if the national interest is protected in other ways, we should not prevent a situation where some countries move in a particular direction if they feel so. And I think that Europe needs to surprise once again. Europe needs to come up with the ideas where people say, oh, that's good, that's what Europe stands for. So right now there is amongst this huge pile of documents that the Commission, so before this session we agreed that with the Commissioner that I would blame everything bad with Brussels on her and on the Commission, but I'm not. And
I would keep saying, and I still love you. That's the deal.
But amongst the piles of documents that the Commission is forking out every day, there is one document which is very interesting. It's a document, a consultation document on the social pillar of Europe. I think it's being put into place with the Swedish government. Yeah. And it's an idea which I love, where apart from having economic criteria, those countries in the Eurozone should also go for a strengthened social pillar and social charter, which should be open voluntarily for other countries to join in. It has to do with living standards, it has to do with workers' rights, it has to do with mobility, it has to do with pensions, it has to do with all the things that President Obama mentioned this morning at the end of the day, when he acknowledged that while making a positive case for globalization, we have to realize that there are some people which are really suffering, who are really suffering. And I think that's the next big thing for Europe, going for a social dimension, but not making ourselves hostage to a situation where there needs to be unanimity. Those of us who want to go for it should be allowed to go for it.
And if I can just say, because you asked me what I think about two-speed, and I didn't directly answer, I do believe that we have to give space for Eurozone as priority. If you are not a Eurozone member, obviously you cannot dictate to the Eurozone what they do further. But there are other dimensions where we have to open up space. And it's not a matter of speed, it is a matter of necessity. And necessity, rational decision-making is what has to dictate. So I just wanted to be fair to your question.
General, let me push to you and ask you a question about US views about Europe. We have a presidential election going on at the moment where one of the main candidates has raised a question about US participation in NATO, been very critical of Germany, very favorable towards Russia. I don't necessarily specifically comment on that, but just more broadly, should our friends in Europe be worrying that American commitment and interest and dependability about Europe is in some way now in question, is in doubt?
It's a very interesting question. I think that one of the things that weighs on our minds in this country is that when you have big summits like NATO and you get agreement to do something and to say, you know, raise your defense budgets to a minimum of 2%, and everybody agrees to it, as they did in Prague in 2002, and now it's 2016 and we're still talking about the same issue, that has a very deflating effect in my country. I mean, and frankly, it's got to be stopped. We either all in this together, we do what we say we're going to do, or it's not going to work. I mean, and so we're still recovering from this period of we agree to everything, but really we're not serious and we don't have to do it. That would be my first point. The second one is a little bit more difficult, in the sense that I think that there's a growing divergence between Western European opinion about international security and Eastern European. And as I travel and I listen, I go to conferences and the like, and the American ear is identifying more and more with the Eastern European rhetoric, if you will, on what's going on in the world, and is having more difficult time with its traditional partners. I really, we could talk for a long time about why, but you hear that. I was at a conference in Munich in February, and the Prime Minister of Russia got up and he said, in almost a direct quote, "We are heading towards a new Cold War." My Western European friends spent the next 2 days trying to convince me that he didn't mean it or he didn't say it. My Eastern European friends said, "See, we told you." So there's a little bit of a dialogue difference here that I think the next American president has to reassert and reconvince Europeans that A, we are interested, we're engaged, and we're willing to do the heavy lift as long as we're all in this together.
I've read a big sign telling us that our time has run out. I'm afraid we've only just scratched the surface of all the different issues that we could have talked about. So if I just ask you to please thank our panelists, Kristalina Georgieva, Joseph Muscat, and General James Jones. Thank you very much.